Welcome, everyone, to this week's Menlo Midweek podcast. My name is Mark, and this is a bit of a special episode because not only do we have Phil here with us.
Hey, everybody.
Hey. But we also have Candice here as well. Candice, we are so grateful for you being here. And if people are like, who is Candice and why is she here? Candice is one of our awesome volunteers at our Menlo Park campus. Her and her family attends there, as well as being a licensed counselor. So, Candice, how about you introduce yourself to people that might not know you? Where are you from? How'd you find Menlo? And then we'll jump in from there.
Great. Yes, thank you first so much for having me. So I am a licensed marriage and family therapist.
Okay.
My family and I have been coming to Menlo Church for about a year and a half, and just had been looking for a community that has some of these deep conversations. So I really appreciate this opportunity to dissect what does mental health and faith look like when they're integrated together as one.
Yeah. How did you find Menlo?
Oh, that's a good question. I started first going to Menlo during the big sanctuary days when I was single, way back in the day when there was like hundreds and hundreds of people.
Okay.
And then, yeah, that's a good question. I think that we had just been looking around for a while, and Menlo felt like our heartbeat and kind of the way that we uniquely practice our faith and the worship and the sermons.
Awesome. And were you originally from the area?
No, I'm originally from Central California, but I've lived in the Bay for 20 years, so I feel native.
Yeah.
That's like someone who is from Central California that would describe it that way. Because when you're like, no, I'm not from the area. I'm from Central California. And to me, as a Midwesterner, like if
it's all
someone
the same.
described it, like, yeah, you're from California. But I know I've been here long enough to know that it's like multiple states in one state. And for somebody from Central California, the Bay Area is like a completely different animal. So.
Oh, yes. It was quite a shell shock when I first moved up here. Yeah.
This is a fun question for you to ask. For people that are from Central California, where does Central California start and end?
Oh, that's a good question.
Yeah.
I would say from the Grapevine to after Fresno.
Okay. Interesting. I feel like those answers always vary, and depending on if you're coastal Central California, that's different than if you're inland Central California. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. Well, Candice, we're just so thankful for you being here and excited just to open up this conversation. And it's all part of our Sound Mind series that we're in right now for May, our mental health awareness month as well. It's kind of coinciding with that. And really the goal of this conversation is to look at faith and mental health, not as they are at odds with each other. It's not an either or, but it's how can we integrate this with our holistic self, our holistic faith. And I'm just very curious about how as your professional life, you see clients a lot. You have a lot of background, a large background in basically coaching people along and trying to integrate both faith and also taking a very science-based approach to mental health and what that looks like. And there was probably a time at which those felt deeply at odds with each other. And now as we're progressing along a little bit further, it feels like they can become more integrated. So I'm curious, what has that journey been like for you, and how do you see those two integrating?
Yeah, so I started my education at USC, which is, a secular university. And I've been studying now the field of mental health for 20 years. So it has been quite a personal formation.
Yeah, for sure.
As well as a professional one. So when to become a therapist, you get a master's degree or higher, and then you have to sit for 3,000 hours to be licensed, which is a lot of time. So when, other non-licensed professionals try to replicate the services, it's just not the same. Okay. So once you get those 3,000 hours, which is basically practicing therapy under supervisor, then you sit for 2 board exams. Yeah. Okay, so all of that happened, and then I go to start my private practice. And at the time, I had an opportunity to join what was affiliated group of Christian therapists. So I had my own practice, but was alongside other believers. Right. And since that point, my practice has always been about 80% Christian.
Interesting.
And so early in that process, I went back to school. I went to seminary to study biblical theology because I wanted to learn more how to integrate the two. And I will say, the more that I learn about the Bible and God's heart, and the more that I learn about things like neuroscience, to me, they're married so easily. And the things that become discovered in neuropsych are things that we already hear about in the Bible. And so, of course, that makes sense. If God created all things, then of course God is within psychology, within healing, within the way that our minds are created and how we can be the healthiest as human beings. So it's been really cool for my faith journey and my practice to continue to learn about both of those things. And I don't find conflict between the two of them. I constantly just see more and more amazement of how God works within our health and healing.
Yeah, I'm curious, what are some of the common misconceptions that you might hear about how those two would be at odds with each other?
Yeah, quite a few, actually. So I think that a lot of our culture puts spirituality in one category and then life in, different categories. So you would have, spirituality in science, spirituality in art, spirituality in education. And like I said, I believe that if God created all things, then we live within a snow globe of God's creation. And so that's one thing, is that people just see them as separate. And so it's hard to see it coexisting if, my faith is over here, but my career is over here and my intellect is over here. And so it feels disjointed to people. Also, I would say that sometimes we have an oversimplistic way of seeing God. And so people feel like, okay, if Jesus came to give us life and to give it to us abundantly, then why am I struggling? Why I shouldn't wake up and not be able to get out of bed. I shouldn't have so much consuming fear that it's hard for me to go to work. I shouldn't be addicted to these things. And so then people, out of shame or fear, kind of disassociate or compartmentalize those parts of themselves. The other thing would be, sometimes we say, why can't I just pray this away? And feeling like faith or Jesus should be enough. And again, forgetting that if Jesus created all things because he's God and the divine creator, then he's within things like medicine and within things like technology. And so seeing God in something like a psychotropic medication, and how the same way that we don't over-spiritualize needing insulin if you're diabetic, that we shouldn't over-spiritualize needing an antidepressant. So those are just a few things that come to mind, but I think we can struggle quite a bit as believers with there's something wrong with me, and maybe I'm not a real Christian, or I'm not right with God if I'm feeling these things. And it actually prevents us from getting help because we have so much shame. There's a fourth thing that comes to mind. So the other thing that comes to mind too, and I say this a lot in my practice, is that as believers, we come to a church community and we assume that it's always good. And sometimes we don't have enough information around like things like spiritual abuse and how if you're in an unhealthy church community or getting information, like if someone's saying you shouldn't go to therapy, you shouldn't use medication, that we're not always equipped to have the critical skepticism within our faith and to realize that spiritual abuse is a real thing. And sometimes authority figures within faith can misuse power and actually increase that sense of shame within ourselves. And I actually work with a lot of spiritual abuse.
Interesting. That fourth part is really interesting. Phil, I'm curious for your perspective. You've been in the church world pretty much all of your life. Famously started speaking at the age of 8. I'm curious.
It's all called the ministry today. I didn't start. I started preaching.
I heard you were lead pastoring at the age of 8. Am I wrong?
I started preaching on Sunday mornings at 16.
Okay.
Yeah. You wouldn't have wanted to hear me preach at 8.
Okay.
I love that visual.
Yeah. Still, 16 is pretty young. As you've been involved in the world of church, how has the church landscape either shifted over time? We talked a little bit about being able to identify parts of church intersection with I think you called it a critical skepticism. So where those intersect as well, I'm curious as your perspective on where church was, paint the landscape for us, and where do you feel like it should be going?
Yeah, well, I talked about this a little bit in the first week of the series on the weekend, that I feel like I've watched this pendulum swing pretty dramatically.
Right.
And the thing that's tricky about church, especially intergenerational church, is that you have people all along that pendulum spectrum. Like, it's not like, well, because now the like new thing is we're much more aware of power imbalance and spiritual abuse. That like is just a description of everyone. No, no, no. I would say for some people, that to them just feels like this weird thing they're not connected to or concerned about at all. And for them, they're very much still in the like, I'm gonna, pray this away. I just need to do another Bible study. If I have enough faith, all this goes away. And I think, to your point, Candice, this sort of like disintegration that's pretty easy for us to do specifically in the space of mental health. And then I think we also have people, I would argue that actually I can preach a sermon that they just don't like, and they will describe that as spiritual abuse. I'm hearing it all along, and so I think understanding what your own center of gravity is as a leader, as an individual, maybe as a person of faith, and being able to go, hey, for me, I know my own story, and I know like potential trigger points that in my own healing and the work that God's doing in me, if I'm in a church that maybe it's unintentional, but they dismiss the need for mental health support. For me, I know that's going to be particularly disruptive to God's work in my life, and I'm probably going to have a much bigger pressure point to that. For other people, that just may not be the same thing for them, and so I think it's really tricky to understand in sort of the the cultural problem of if it bleeds, it leads. I think if you were to just go like read about spiritual abuse, you would assume based on the prevalence of how many articles written about church or faith right now, let's say 50% of them would be about spiritual abuse. And I mean, here at Menlo, we're navigating harms from decades ago. Even like right now, we take this very, very seriously. But if you were to assume, well, I guess 50% of churches and leaders are abusing people, I don't think that's a fair statistic.
Yeah.
And so I think trying to navigate that and go, what are those pain points, particularly related to mental health? And, you probably wouldn't listen to your pastor tell you why you should get a certain medical procedure for cancer. You probably, like, you might listen, but you're not, like, your doctor's a part of that conversation too. You're going to try and come up with an integrated way to go, here's what prayer support looks like in this part of my life. Here's what medical care looks like in this part of my, I'm going to approach it from a holistic perspective. And I think that if mental health is for some reason treated as something different, that should be a significant red flag. And I think that just like you can go to a counselor, and that counselor can be a great counselor, but just not the one for you for any number of different reasons. I would say I always try to like sort of de-spiritualize for people. If you're at a church, even if that's Menlo, and you go, hey, I know that there's healing God has for me, and this just is not it. Like I need something that's not here. I literally sometimes help people. I know lots of churches in there. I know lots of pastors, so I'll help people navigate what that is. My question is always like, would you do me a favor, and as you navigate what this might look like, particularly as it relates to mental health, don't just look for a church that conforms to preferences. Look for a church that really can hold healing for you, where leaders are guiding you into the path of life. And I think that is, it's not one and done. Early on in ministry, I heard the line, it takes all kinds of churches to reach all kinds of people. And I think that's true, so Menlo's not going to be for everybody, but it'll be for somebody. And I think how we try to deliver this conversation, this is the first in a long trajectory of how we talk about it. My own story is a part of that. There's just no way that it can't be, just to be honest about that. Restorative justice at Menlo from abuse that happened decades ago that we'll keep talking about, that we'll keep delivering care for, that like our staff just finished a year-long training around restorative justice at our like leadership team and management level. So those are all things that are true of us. And if somebody goes, well, those are all really triggering for me, okay, like that's totally fine. Like I'm not applying judgment to someone else for that. We're going to be who we're going to be and trust the Lord with all of it.
Yeah. Phil, what do you think it is specifically about the mental health aspect versus a physical health aspect that brings some sort of taboo or brings some sort of, we can parse out very clearly if you're sick and you have an injury, you can go to a doctor, and that's probably mostly universally accepted as good and something you should do. Why is there some stigma or some whatever that is around the mental health side of that?
Well, I mean, I think Candice probably has a much more, much better articulation of this. But I would say on some levels, it's historic. So if we think about like hierarchy of needs over the course of human history, our sort of psychological safety and healing oftentimes took a back seat to like, do I have food and water? Do I have shelter?
Sure.
Am I physically safe? Am I physically injured? Those are just more acute pain points. So I think for a long time in human history, those things were sort of in the front burner. And then as civilizations developed and all of a sudden psychological safety became a higher priority, something that people had space, time, and money to address. Well, then really in the 20th century, especially, we watched a movement of people take on this work, oftentimes take on this work and take on God at the same time. And so the work that people were doing in the academic space was sort of sometimes pitched against. So it was like, hey, we're trying to come up with psychological answers instead of God. And I agree completely with Candice that they're entirely compatible, that the God of the universe that created us, created our minds and created it to work well. So we can take the best of all of it. But I think that only continued to perpetuate itself into like the sexual revolution and into like 60s and 70s cultural uprising, where then you watched this deep bifurcation that we're really still living in now, where you had kind of the quote unquote secular and sacred, or churched and unchurched.
Interesting.
And so it was like, well, what answers are church answers that like God's in favor of, kind of the religious right stuff? And then what are the answers that are like for the world that are anti-God? And when we live intellectually in that space of separation and bifurcation, it's no wonder that we do that personally in our own life as well. So I think that it takes work to say, hey, this deep polarization is not helpful, has not served anybody. And so how do we live with deeper integration intellectually, even historically, so that we can do it personally and spiritually? But feel free to clean it up.
Yeah, there's two things that come to mind for me. One is just the educational piece of what is therapy. And I think sometimes it feels kind of scary, or like, someone is kind of reading my internal mail and not actually knowing that a licensed therapist, that's healthcare. Like, we are governed by a state board, similarly to, the way that a doctor would be. And so because of that, right, we're backed by a lot of laws and ethics. And there's a few things there. I like that as a therapist, that there's a lot of gateways that protect individuals from your care provider. So that's different from like a biblical counselor. If they're not licensed, is not bound by those laws. And they're also legally not allowed to be providing mental health services, because that is healthcare. The same way with like a life coach.
Sure.
It doesn't mean that people don't do that, but that is a regulated field, because there's always new laws and ethics and research coming out that we're bound to follow. So I think that's a piece of it, is understanding like who can provide this care. And then underneath that category, yes, licensed professionals, because I'm bound by the state. There's things that I can't say that, maybe religiously I have an opinion of, but because a therapist's role is to provide a space where someone can come as they are, where we provide unconditional positive regard, where we're not projecting our own ideas onto somebody else, that feels wrong to some people. The second piece of that is that I think mental health is different from physical health, because mental health often intersects with our faith. So I think as a Christian, I ought to only have pure thoughts, or the Bible says not to trust my flesh. So I don't know what to do with my intuition. I don't know what to do with my gut instinct. This person's saying one thing, but the Bible says I shouldn't trust myself. And so I'm going to default to an authority figure. So I think that's where there's a lot of intersection of my emotional world feels like that's an extension of my spiritual world. It's not this separated thing of like, oh, of course God wants me to be healthy. And so sometimes, I see a doctor, but there's this formation piece about it where my heart and my spirit and my emotion and my mind should all conform to the thoughts and patterns of God. And if that's misaligned, then that's a me and God thing, not a me and my mental health thing. And So I think helping people walk them through in my office, really understanding the science behind, well, what's happening in our neurons and how do thought patterns get created,
Yeah.
and how could understanding that actually put you better in alignment with your spiritual beliefs.
Yeah. So what does that look like? What does a healthy integrated approach to both faith and mental health like? What are some characteristics that someone is headed in the right direction with that?
Yeah, so I think if we're looking at practitioners, I appreciate practitioners that blend both things well. That can appreciate that, right, if God is within science, and as we're learning more about the brain, as we learn about human patterns and what works for interventions and what's effective for healing, that someone can be rich in that intellect and also hold true to biblical concepts. So the way that it looks like in my office is a lot of my work probably does feel secular. However, I can pull in spiritual disciplines and as homework talk about ways that maybe someone should be fasting in response to what we're working through, or they should go to their community group and disclose information. Maybe they should go into some solitude or utilize prayer within the work that we're doing. And so that's where the marriage can be.
Yeah.
And of course, if someone comes in and they have these thoughts about God, like, well, the Bible says that I shouldn't trust my flesh. I actually see a lot of science in there of, is the flesh the same thing as our intuition? Or is the flesh more like what would be described as our id, if we're using Freudian terms? The id is the most primal part of ourselves. It's the stem of the brain that has our desires for fight, flight, comfort, and survival. And does that sometimes take over and allow us to be impulsive and be driven by a part of ourselves that's not holistic, where I see our intuition as something where I believe the Holy Spirit lives, and where we have a gut instinct that's connected to God, where we can walk in a room and sense something and we can use that. So part of the process is discerning what is my impulsive flesh that just wants to act out in a certain way, and what is a deeper knowing within myself. And that is a part of us that gets clarified over a period of time. It's a process of discernment and our own formation and integration.
Interesting. How can someone help? What are some ways that someone can help cultivate either attention to this or practices? You mentioned a few. How can someone get from the step of, I need to help assess where I am mentally, and maybe my next step should be see a therapist, should be talk to someone in my small group or life group, should be disclose this with a spouse or something like that. What are some ways that you've coached people along to give themselves the grace not to tear themselves apart because they're at, the mental part is at odds with each other, but to be able to see that and say, if I take a step, it will be a good positive thing for me.
Yeah, so normalizing this process, that as humans, we're constantly aware of ourselves and our actions. That's what makes us different from other species. And so that's a normal process to wrestle with, something that I'm doing and I'm feeling something in my childhood history. And then what do I do with that? Sometimes as humans, we could process through it or share with a friend and we feel relief and we go back to our life and we can maintain stability. And what I say is, if you've tried everything you can think of and it's not working, that's a good time to sit with therapists because you've already tried it on our own. And the thing is, humans don't grow off a will alone, and that's often a thought is like, oh, but I really want to change it, so I should be able to white knuckle this away. And that's just not how humans are formed. And so there's no shame or condemnation at all in sitting with a therapist. The same way if you had an ear infection, there's no shame in going to a doctor and getting an antibiotic. And so really taking that element out of it and then walking through the process of finding the right fit. I know we have resources, and if you're not in this area, looking for a faith-based therapist on a directory or looking for that in their bio. Which someone will have, on their website somewhere. Mine is a little discreet because I want everyone to feel like they can come to me and And I don't want anyone to feel like, okay, I believe something else and I can't see Candice. However, it's there. You'll see that I went to Western Seminary. You'll see that, faith integrated is a new word I've been using. I've said faith-based for a really long time, but integrated just feels like a better word for me.
Yeah.
And you can ask on a consultation call. Almost every therapist offers a free 15-minute call to assess for fit. And so you could say, I'm a Christian. Do you integrate faith into the treatment process? Tell me more about that. And a therapist should be able to give you a good window to how they engage with faith. And as believers, well, we hear the language. It's a subculture being a Christian. And so when I actually first got into becoming a therapist, I always wanted to be a lawyer, and I ended up having a therapist in college. And she was just a grad student. I loved her. I feel like she changed my life. She never said if she was a Christian, but on our last session, she said something like, our hearts are in the same place. And I just knew. I knew she was a believer. She graduated that year. The next year, I saw another graduate student. And she started talking about faith and like higher power language. And I just knew like this person isn't a believer. She didn't really understand. She was trying to make it work, but without having that authentic understanding of my journey and the way that I've uniquely engaged with the world as a Christian, it just didn't feel like a good match. So that's part of what a Christian therapist can provide is that language and understanding the cultural context of what it means to grow up or at some point in your life, choose to follow Jesus.
Yeah, I love that. I think something that's interesting too is that when we think about mental health and we think about seeing a therapist, that's often the last resort, or it feels like that's the last step in this process that I need to take. And I mean, speaking from experience as someone that is in counseling regularly, it's not something that should just be reserved for when stuff blows up, then I'll see my counselor.
Sure.
And so I think even just opening up the conversation to, even if things are going well, it's still nice to talk about stuff with someone else and to have a space in which you can share and speak honestly and receive coaching and receive maybe what's it like to be on the other side of me? What are some of the blind spots in which I think my life is great, but actually it isn't? Welcoming that conversation isn't and shouldn't just be okay, my life is falling apart. Now I guess it's time to see the therapist.
Sure.
So, Phil, I'm curious, in your life and in your journey, how have you seen that worked well, where there is a wholeness that is both spiritual, a wholeness that is, as you are coaching people on all sorts, we've talked about mental health being a spectrum. What are ways in which you would hope that people in our community are either taking steps or assessing themselves in a way to accurately see where they're at and then take the next appropriate step?
Yeah, I mean, we're going to talk about some of this in the second part of the series this upcoming weekend. So if you're listening to this and it's this week, just come back this weekend. You're going to hear some more of that. If you're listening to this later, good news. You can go listen to the message. But I do think, a lot of our mental and spiritual health, there are some, I would say there's some good prescriptive language that we can find in the New Testament. There is also, I think, great diagnostic tools to be able to go. And like the diagnostic tools for me, I think are particularly helpful as I think about integrating concepts like secure attachment into scriptural values of honesty and transparency. And so, hey, what are the ways that I'm showing up in my regular everyday life that should be sort of just warning lights? If you think about you're like driving down the road and you go, hey, wait a second, my check engine light's on, or you go, hey, wait a second, I'm easily agitated in this conversation for some reason, or man, I'm really withdrawing from this part of my life for some reason. Like, what are some of those things that I think hopefully for us, we don't wait till, my car's been telling me I need windshield washer fluid for the last month, and it's not a huge deal. It's fine. But like if it said check engine light, change oil soon, replace this, you have a recall notice at some point you're like, hey, we should probably wait before the car breaks down. And there is, I think, a scaled up level of care, right? So the way that counseling really started for me after my dad died was a counseling intensive.
Yeah.
Which was like boot camp for counseling. I'd really never done extensive counseling before that, and it did feel like boot camp. You were just in it, and you were like, you're used to in normal counseling format, 45 minutes or an hour, maybe once a week, maybe a couple times a month. And all of a sudden, there's just nowhere to hide. You're like in it, and it's like, hey, we're going to keep talking about this. And there was pre-work and post-work and all that. And for some people, something like that may really be helpful for a breakthrough. If you found yourself like your sort of metaphorical mental and emotional health is in the gutter, and you're like, how do I get out of this? That may be a really helpful first step. For other people, I think, the framework that I've used, to your point, Mark, is I think it's valuable to have a counseling connection just for the sake of rapport.
Yeah.
So, we go to the doctor, like our normal doctor, at least once a year and just get a physical. What does it look like to have even just a baseline with a counselor that's like your counselor? Hey, when I sit down with this person, we have some sort of pre-existing relationship. We're going to be able to step in, and we're not starting at zero every time we meet. So I think wherever you find yourself in that paradigm is helpful. I do think, I talked about this in the first week, there is a sense in which I'm not sure everyone needs to be in counseling all the time forever. And I think that I'll sit down with especially really young leaders, and they've gone through lots. Like, I don't want to minimize that. Right. Life is full, and we've lived through wild times. But I think there's this idea of, like, I can find trauma in every single part of my life all the time, and so I'm just completely overwhelmed, and without this very regular counseling relationship, I can't navigate it. I think there is we want to pursue resilience, not fragility, and I think trying to live in that limbo, even myself, like discern what does that look like, what's healthy and helpful. I think I was talking to a leader, and they were describing their staff culture, and they were talking about how some of their staff culture, they're like these old pickup trucks, and they're the work trucks, and they're banged up, and they're just sort of lumbering down the road and getting work done. And he's like, the other part of our staff team is they're like a bunch of Teslas who are constantly looking for a place to charge. They drive on their own, but they don't know where they're going. And I'm like, that's an amazing description, right? And I'm not glorifying either extreme. Like, I don't think we want to be either one of those. Yeah. And so I think just navigating that in yourself to say, which extreme do I tend to? Yeah. And how do I map back to this biblical vision of wholeness, to letting Jesus work on me? If I'm a workaholic, that's going to look like one thing. If I'm somebody where I'm constantly running or constantly pursuing what the Bible would describe as fleshly impulses that are destructive to me and unhelpful for others, what does that look like for me? So I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all, but I hope this series gives people some diagnostic tools to be able to just go, oh man, some warning lights are happening. Yep. And then sort of this scaled up, like, hey, what does it look like for me to engage with God in this? What are next steps with people in community at Menlo, or even a pastor or a care team member? What does it look like to engage professional counseling? Like, there's a suite of resources. We've never had more resources to this conversation than we have right now. And I hope that one big thing that this does is just sort of lift the lid and make those much more discoverable and remove as much stigma as we can for people to access them.
Yeah.
Can I respond to a few of those things?
Absolutely.
Something that I see often is people will feel like their issues aren't big enough, and there's a comparison. And so just to name that, we as humans can actually be quite resilient and not real. I mean, of course, there's a spectrum of people that are easily offended, but often people are tolerating so much and they don't even realize how much they have withstood over time. And then they come to my office and they say, well, at least, I didn't have these things over here. And comparison is not helpful. That's not what Jesus does with us when he walks with us through our lives. He meets us where we're at. He doesn't minimize where we're at based on where your neighbor is at. And so that's something to consider too, is have I dismissed lights that have gone on because I feel like I can do it, or this is what I've had to do as a survival skill my whole life. And so it's not any different, and it's working. So that's just something to consider. The other thing is, like Phil was saying, there's no one size fits all. There really shouldn't be. It's why I'm not a huge fan of something like a purely CBT model, because it is like, 8 weeks, we're going to go over these prescribed things. And I love the art of therapy.
CBT, Christian Biblical Therapy.
No, cognitive behavioral
There we
therapy.
go. I was like, I'm
Yeah.
guessing at acronyms. We love them.
Yes. Okay. So cognitive behavioral therapy is a buzz intervention that is most repeatable and is often used in healthcare settings, like if you were going to your hospital for therapy, because it's prescriptive. It's 8 weeks you would follow this thing. I encourage people to find a blend of there's some helpful interventions, and you want a clinician that can be intuitive and assess with you what you need, and not just have something already prescribed for you before you walk in the room. And so for some people, they come in, they know some objective that they have for their therapy. They do all the things, they're highly motivated. They come in, they come out, they graduate from therapy. Certainly have an open door policy. So like Phil's saying, I have clients all the time who I won't see for a few years, and then something comes up in their life. They email me, I really need to talk about this. We talk about this, and then I see them in the next, few years, which is great because you have that continuity of care and that history. So some people have a really quick model. There's some people I have seen for years because their trauma is so complex that it's layers by layer, and really being able to suss that out with a clinician. And you can ask them early on, what do you think? How long do you think this will take? I don't think anyone could give a definitive answer right away, but therapy has a flow to it that I feel with all of my clients, where someone is first going through having awareness of the issues of themselves. Then they get to a point where they're kind of deconstructing all of those things. That's the messy point. I often liken it to if you've ever cleaned out a closet or a garage, where midway, it's messier than when you started because you have stuff everywhere and it feels kind of chaotic and you're like, what did I do to myself? That's the midpoint. It's not the stopping point. After that is when we proverbially organize, throw things away, and make it look nice and neat afterwards and get to that integrated point. Yeah. And so that's a process that I see people going through often. And so really trusting your clinician and having a good trust in yourself. Is this someone that has a plan? Do they know how to answer these questions? So I feel like there's some momentum happening here, and then giving way to that journey and how it works.
Well, and I do think that there are extremes in that, right? Because there's the overly prescriptive, the example of CBT, where it's essentially like a curriculum, where it's like, hey, let's move you through this and get you out.
That's right.
I also have navigated with people where it's like, hey, I sit with a counselor and it's essentially talk therapy. There is no guidance. It's just tell me more about that, tell me more about that. And so I think some of it is identifying, like where is that sweet spot? And that sweet spot is probably different for each person. That's got to be sort of part of. I tell people counseling is like dating, right? Like it may not be that the first counselor is the right fit, and that's okay. You wouldn't have stopped dating after the first person that you met wasn't the right person. Like that's a wild picture of what that looks like. And so I think that's a great word around what's a sort of 15-minute, just sort of calibration call. Could this work? But even if you get a couple appointments in and you go, you know what, I thought this would work. I was a little bit on the fence and it's not. That's okay. Like that's fine. I would imagine that every counselor has.
And I would say have those conversations, because therapy is a microcosm of the rest of the world. So when we talk about things like attachment, we project onto our therapists things that we would engage with our parents. So sometimes people don't want to do therapy, and maybe it's a bad fit, but maybe it's, this is uncomfortable. We're getting close. I'm not used to close, safe relationships. I don't want to do this. And talking that out with a therapist to be able to figure out, is this a fit issue, or is there something deeper going on that I actually need to lean into? Therapy is quite complex, which is why we get such robust training to be able to really decipher what's going on in someone, and then of course respecting what they choose.
Sure. Yeah, it's good.
What are signs that the clinician is working, that this is a relationship that I need to pursue? Because in the midst of these conversations, people are going to feel uncomfortable. It is going to be difficult. So, what are some signs that are like, okay, that it's worth it to keep going in this and not to jump ship to go to see someone else?
Sure. So the biggest indicator of therapy prognosis is your relationship with the therapist. So
Interesting.
there's a ton of different interventions out there,
Yeah.
and actually, what will help you progress or not has little to do with interventions and much more to do with that safe, secure, reparative relationship. There's been brain scans that show that that relationship alone helps to repair neurons.
Whoa.
And so, yeah, that's what's so healing. So I would say if you have that relationship, and paired with, are they giving me good interventions? Do I feel like they have a plan? And again, you could always ask, right? What's the plan here? How am I doing? Clients do that with me all the time. Where am I at on the journey? And some of that is they just, want some reassurance. But a good therapist should be able to say, right, I'm holding this for you. I see something in my mind on your behalf. And we're walking through this, and this is where I think you're at on that. So I would say having a good, safe person, and also figuring out, well, yeah, does it feel like good work? Does it feel like after I've had a hard workout that I'm sore in a good way, or is there harm happening here? And of course, in any relationship can be harmful. And so really assessing, did that therapist, are they crossing my boundaries? Are they talking about their personal life too much? Are they asking me to do things that I feel uncomfortable with? In those ways, that's like if you went to the gym and then pulled a muscle or broke your arm, you would say, oh, that was not a helpful way of stretching my muscles. And so you want to feel like, oh, that was hard, but I feel growing pains from it, not any kind of harm or abuse.
Phil, for you, you mentioned counseling intensive. How did you land on that as being the correct step for you?
Ministry is a funny space. And so I have friends in ministry that have engaged at different points. There's a lot of stuff in ministry that exists for pastors or leaders in the church who have what I artfully call colored outside the lines. Like if something has happened or they, have kind of compromised morally standards that they've set or that have been set for them. There's a ton of stuff. There's way less stuff for how do you, what I would call kind of preventative maintenance. What do you do in a way that either helps you get healthy from wherever you are or helps you stay healthy. And so that immediately narrows the pool of people that specialize in pastors or ministry leaders and then do that. And I have a friend in ministry who's been in ministry probably twice as long as I have. And this has been a regular part of his pursuit of Jesus. And then probably every 3 or 4 years, he does one of these intensives with this specific organization, and it's like a leading organization for it in the country. And so when he and I started to talk about this, it was one of the options that I was considering. And then I did some of these calibration calls with different options, and then it also worked out that this particular organization was 40 minutes from where we lived in Colorado. So people would fly in from all around the country to do it, but it was literally where we lived. Cool. So that definitely helped. And when we talked through, hey, here's what you're facing, here's some of your story, here's the stuff that we want to kind of get through as really a precursor to an ongoing healthy therapeutic relationship, that's when a counseling intensive made most sense. And in my experience, there are counselors that really believe in and prioritize counseling intensives. And then there are counselors that are on the other side that actually don't want them. They're like, oh, it's kind of microwave relationship. It's not as effective. I found that starting that way, for me, starting that way and then continuing on in a more intermittent way with the same counselor was really helpful. Yeah. And now that same counselor and I still connect. It's significantly less frequently, but he's my counselor. And, I just was texting him the other day, and I think that type of relationship is years in the making. Yeah. And what you can do or can't do with any particular counselor, how often you see them, that's pretty individualized. And I think, obviously there are benefits to licensed therapists. There are benefits to biblical counselors. There are benefits to spiritual directors, right? And I think that likely there's going to be a fit or a combination of fits for anybody given any number of different circumstances in their life.
Yeah, thanks. Candice, what else? What else do you want to add to this conversation around mental health, around counseling?
Yeah, I love this conversation so much. It's so close to my heartbeat because freedom can be found when we lean into God and engage in the practical world. And that it might seem so obvious to some. I grew up in a very conservative town, and that there was a lot of separation and a skepticism about the world, which it's yes, and, like, yes, there's things we're in the world, but not of the world. And God created the world, and God created earth. And it's incredible that, like, there's all this technology that was just like discovered in different elements in the ground. And so really seeing the awe of God in the way that we engage with our being and our embodied formation. And so, yeah, I just love this conversation, and I want for people to leave feeling that sense too of freedom and the expansion of who God is, the expansion that, oh yeah, if God created me, then he knows how brains are supposed to operate. He knows what integration feels like and looks like. He wants me to be of one mind where I don't have split selves. And having different parts of ourselves is really common, and that's not the same thing as having, a disassociated personality disorder. We have all the time. You think about January 1, we want to, get healthier. And there's a part of us that wants to get healthy and work out. And there's a part of us that wants to eat that cake left over from New Year's Eve. And really reckoning with there are different parts of ourselves that are at odds all the time. And God calls us into one, and he's after each piece of us. And that's part of the salvation journey. It's not just we accept Christ and then it's done, and now, we're ready to be all things to all people. It's really this process of formation where now we see the world in partnership with the Holy Spirit, in partnership with Jesus. And that is kind of the first step of doing the work and really understanding how sin takes place within us, how sins that have been done to us create different thought patterns and affect our relationships, and it goes really deep, and there can be freedom once we understand and reintegrate that process.
Thank you. Yeah. Phil, what about for you? Anything else to add?
I would say my hope in a lot of what we're doing now is related to shame, that I think for a lot of people this conversation has been very shame-inducing. For lots of different reasons, but I think one of those, and I'll mention it this upcoming weekend, like anxiety is not sin. And I'll get emails literally just for saying that. Like people will be like, but the Bible says do not be anxious. And, Paul literally is talking to the church at Philippi in the same letter that we're studying this weekend in chapter 2. And he's like, hey, I'm going to send Epaphroditus to you, and it'll be great because I'll be less anxious for you. Okay, so is Paul saying he was sinning? Like, doesn't make any sense. So I think we have to understand the difference between descriptive and prescriptive nature in the scriptures. And then we also have to recognize, like, what is the leading thing that God is calling us to, and then what are the things that flow as a result of that? And so hopefully by destigmatizing, hey, depression, anxiety, these are physiological realities that there is a someday, one day kingdom of heaven reality where they no longer exist. I would say that, anxiety is not sin. It is caused by being in a sinful world, and it can lead to sin. Like, we can make sinful choices as a result. One of the most painful things for me is when I navigate people who have experienced abuse, and we're navigating this with survivors of abuse from Menlo from decades ago right now, like people that I'll sit across the table with. Not alone, I always have somebody with me, but we'll be talking about some abuse that they've experienced. And lots of times their coping mechanisms over the course of decades have been extremely destructive coping mechanisms. What happened to them is not their fault. But somewhere along the way, God's going to have to get a hold of those parts of their life, because if those destructive coping mechanisms are the ones that they continue to walk in, they're going to continue to have damage and re-injure themselves. And I think trying to have that conversation in a way that doesn't put more shame on people, I've heard it put this way, that sin says shame on you. Jesus says shame off you. That's what he does. And so just understanding where is it that shame is driving your decision making, and this like shame spiral of, hey, I'm in this kind of lower level thinking where fight, flight, or freeze are my base instincts. I do something that's self-soothing. Oh gosh, now I feel shamed because I did that, because I was responding to this pain or this past trauma. And now because I have that shame, I'm back into the same loop and I do the same type of behavior, and it's a downward spiral. And so being able to say, it's okay, that is a normal human response. God is not surprised by it. He loves you. He wants to know you more deeply. He wants you to live integrated. I hope that people take that message away, and that we're able to, again, whether you are somebody that sort of has stuffed your mental health down somewhere deep in the recesses of who you are, and you're living wildly disintegrated, and resilience for you looks like doing the dangerous, scary work of going into those cabinets you haven't been in before and organizing the garage. I did that to a room in my garage this weekend, so that feels very real right now. And then on the other side, sort of the Teslas that are always looking to charge and it's driving themselves, they're not sure where they're going. Resilience for them looks like, hey, you're going to have to navigate reality where we experience difficult and painful things in a broken world all the time, and we keep moving, and we need each other, actually. So my hope is to destigmatize the conversation, to remove shame as our primary motivator for God doing the work in us, and hopefully just making these resources more and more visible to people.
That's a great word. Thanks, Bill. Candice, thank you so much.
Thank you. I could be here all day.
That's awesome. Thanks for being here.
And we recognize that, this is just the start of a conversation that needs to be ongoing. And so if you need help starting, if you don't know where to, we'd love to walk through that with you. Even if it's just hey, I don't know what I need next, but I know I need something. Please text us, 650-600-0402. You can reach out to any one of us on staff here, and we'd love to just help you figure out what is next for you, as well as point you towards any resources that we have. You can head over to menlo.church/connect. There you can find some series resources for our Sound Mind series, which include a list for counselors and includes sermon study guides that are asking internal questions about how we can help people in our own lives, in our own communities, open up conversations around mental health. So again, this is a start of a thing here at Menlo that we hope is ongoing and lives past this series. Candice, again, thank you so much for being on.
Thank you for having me.
It was great. Phil, thank you as well. Have a wonderful week, everybody, and we'll see you soon.
See you guys.